Welcome. Some stories begin with drums and trumpets. This one begins in a dark room with a cough. Tonight, we return to a time when illness ruled lives and silence was louder than medicine. Let history speak in whispers now. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, softly told, consider subscribing. You'll always be welcome here. You have a fever, and the church thinks it's demons. Long before the bells ring for lauds, someone stirs in the straw. Their mouth is dry. A heaviness pulls at their limbs. The air is close, thick with the scent of sweat, smoke, and old wool. A single cough echoes in the rafters, sharp enough to wake the child beside them. Their breath rattles softly in the pre-dawn stillness, a sound barely louder than the creak of the rafters. Dust floats like ash in the thin line of light leaking in through a split in the shutter. Chickens mutter outside. A pig scratches itself against the wall. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog sighs. The floor is packed earth, the walls damp with the breath of uncounted winters. A coarse wool blanket, if it can be called, that lies crumpled at the edge of the bed, kicked away during the fever dreams that gripped the night. There are no windows, only a wooden shutter cracked open for air, though the wind that enters is more smoke than breeze. The house has one room, and in it 5 people, maybe more. The children sleep crosswise, heads near feet. One of them is coughing in their sleep, a sound like a dying bird. Outside, the village slumbers beneath a sky without color. Inside, fever begins its slow and silent work. A mother opens her eyes, or tries. Her lids are crusted at the corners. Her breath tastes like copper. She places a hand on her belly, then her chest. Both are hot, too hot. When she tries to lift herself, her head swims. Still, she rises. She must. No one else will. The dough must be kneaded. The goat needs milking. Illness waits for no one, and neither does hunger. The sick rise slowly, if at all. Their breath is shallow. Every movement brings pain, but the animals must be tended and water fetched. The field won't till itself, even if the hands that till it tremble. A man leans on a beam as he dresses, lacing his boots with shaking fingers. He cannot stop coughing. There is no doctor to call, no promise of medicine or relief. Only the clumsy comfort of hot broth and the biting hope of prayer. In a world without thermometers, antibiotics, or even an understanding of bacteria, illness is never just a matter of the body. A hot brow or pale lips carry meaning far beyond the physical. Those around them glance away nervously. There are whispers of punishment, of imbalance, of sin, and so the sick wrap themselves in silence. They do not speak of their pain unless it cannot be hidden. To be ill is to be suspected of weakness, of wickedness, or worse, of harboring something unclean in the soul. For most in this time, the church offers the only guidance. Fever, it is said, might be a test from God, or worse, the work of demons. A shaking body or vacant stare could suggest possession. Delirium might be mistaken for madness or divine punishment. It's not uncommon for a priest to be called before a healer. The first step, always, is prayer. Not the hurried, whispered words of habit, but the desperate kind, choked and broken, cried in the dark when no one else is listening. The sick are sprinkled with holy water. Psalms are read aloud beside their beds. Crosses are drawn in the air above their heads. Women, especially older women, often serve as the village's only source of treatment. They bring lavender in cloth bundles, rosemary steeped in wine, and honey to soothe a raw throat. Their hands are worn, the nails dark with soil. They know how to crush the roots that help break a fever. They know which mushrooms to avoid. Their wisdom has no parchment, no seal, but it is trusted quietly. But if the sick worsen, suspicion can easily turn against the very hands trying to help. In one village, an old midwife is blamed after 3 infants die. In another, a woman is seen grinding herbs at night by candlelight. By morning, she is accused of summoning spirits. There are murmurs of witches and whispers of demons in the hedgerows. There are no hospitals. There is no safe place to lie down and recover. Most lie in their own beds, if they're lucky, tucked into corners, hidden behind a curtain of homespun linen. Outside, life continues. Church bells, toll hooves, clatter over cobbles. The sick are not spoken of directly. Those who fall ill are often left to stew in silence, broken only by whispered prayers or the occasional splash of water in a bowl. The fever takes its course, and sometimes, by morning, the bed is empty. Sometimes the body is still warm. The illness spreads quickly. One child develops a cough, then another begins to shiver at night. A father tries to continue his work, but drops his tools mid-swing. Food spoils because no one can rise to cook it. The household slows. The neighbors stop coming. And so begins the quiet unraveling of a household. The fire burns lower each day. No one fetches kindling. A pot of barley sits cold, untouched. A baby's cry goes unanswered for longer than it should. Outside, neighbors avert their eyes as they pass. Inside, touch becomes a risk. In wealthier homes, manors, and monasteries, there are tinctures of imported spices, jars of preserved lemons, and linen changed daily. Servants carry trays of broth, wearing cloths tied across their faces. Astrologers are consulted. One noblewoman is bled 3 times before the fever breaks. Another is packed in snow. For the poor, there is only prayer and porridge. Caring for the sick becomes an act of courage. Few dare approach the infected unless they must. The smell of sickness, a mix of sweat, vomit, and damp straw becomes its own warning sign. It clings to fabric, to hair, to breath. It tells a story before words are spoken. Compare this to today, when even minor symptoms can be treated with pills and rest. In the medieval world, a sore throat might lead to days of choking. A scratch from a pig's tusk could end in blood poisoning. A fever could mean 6 days of hallucinations and then death. Death lingers at the threshold of even the smallest wounds. There are no gloves, no antiseptics. The same hand that soothes a child might wring out a cloth used to clean a wound. Illness doesn't just spread through breath. It rides on kindness, on care, and so touch becomes sacrifice. When death seems near, a priest may be called. He arrives with holy water and a crucifix, murmuring Latin beneath his breath. The sick are offered one last chance to confess they can still speak. Sometimes their mouths are too dry. Sometimes their minds have already gone. The priest touches their forehead, anoints their lips, lifts their hand, and folds it gently across their chest. A final blessing, a whispered psalm. The body cools before the sun has risen. Burials must happen quickly, especially in warmer months. The grave is shallow, dug behind the churchyard or on family land. The family watches in silence. The priest says the words, "Earth returns to earth." But not all deaths are marked. In some cases, the body is carried out before dawn. No procession, no choir, just two brothers, a cart, and a quiet prayer beneath their breath. If recovery comes, it leaves marks. Hair falls out, limbs swell, joints ache through the next winter. Some never walk the same again. Some lose sight in one eye. Some see visions in their sleep. The village treats the survivor with caution. They've come too close to the edge, and not everyone returns whole. Sometimes recovery itself becomes a curse. In the days that follow, there is bread to be made, water to be fetched, lambs to be birthed and tended. Whether the sick recover or not, the rhythm of life continues. Illness in the Middle Ages does not pause the world. It simply passes through it like fog or famine or war. The animals must be fed, the fields must be turned, children must be taught how to spin and how to gather eggs and how to bury the dead without crying too loud. The neighbors will visit again in time, first with caution, then with baskets. Life returns slowly, like spring after a bitter frost. What is most striking, when compared to the presentees, not only the lack of medicine, but the lack of certainty. A body falls ill, and no one knows why. A child coughs and then dies. A woman survives a high fever, only to fall ill again a week later and fade. The suffering is endured with little comfort, little explanation, and few answers. And so the candles are lit. A figure lies still beneath wool blankets. The house falls quiet again. Outside, the mist lifts, and the first crows call across the rooftops of a village, too used to grief to flinch when they hear it. Even sorrow becomes familiar. Even death becomes routine. The real story of the Black Death. It was October, the year of our Lord, 1347, and the port of Messina in Sicily opened its weary arms to a fleet of ships it had not summoned. The sailors who came were not the men they once were. Their skin bore strange swellings, black and bruised like the rot of overripe fruit. Some were too weak to walk. Others lay dead below deck, the rats picking at what remained. The air that rolled from their vessels carried no smoke nor salt, but something colder, unseen, unnamed, a sharpness that slipped into the lungs and settled behind the eyes. A weight without explanation. When the ships dropped anchor, the city stirred, not in welcome, but in suspicion. These men brought no song, no laughter, no barrels of wine or tales from Constantinople, only silence. A silence that tasted wrong. The people watched, the sailors groaned, and the deaths began. No one knew the word plague. Not yet, but already they felt something had changed, not just in the city, but in the world. From Messina, word traveled by foot, by cart, by windswept gossip, passed between cloistered monks and tavern cooks. Strange deaths in the harbor, men bleeding from their noses and mouths, boils that pulsed like living blisters under the arms and between the legs. Some bodies blackened, as if charred, though no fire had touched them. To the north, in Genoa, a dockworker's son fell ill after unloading bundles from a merchant galley. By morning, he was coughing blood. By nightfall, his entire family was gone. In Avignon, the papal court began receiving sealed letters from every corner of Europe. The tone in each was the same: confusion at first, then alarm, then despair. This was not a familiar sickness, not fever, not flux, not leprosy, nor even the terrible St. Anthony's fire. This was something else, something that walked invisible, with claws touching doorposts and doorknobs, leaving behind nothing but mourning. And so, by winter's breath, the continent braced itself. The Black Death had arrived, though it had no name yet. Avignon, seat of Pope Clement VI, was no ordinary town. It pulsed with ceremony, pageantry, and clerical power. Cardinals whispered beneath jeweled tapestries. Choirs sang beneath the ribs of vaulted ceilings. And still, the plague came. Within weeks, the burial pits around the Rhine were full. Guy de Chauliac, the Pope's personal physician, recorded what he saw with both horror and humility. Boils the size of eggs. Patients who could not keep down holy water. People who walked upright in the morning, clutching rosaries, and were laid on planks by vespers. Pope Clement VI ordered mass prayers. He consecrated the entire Rhine River so that corpses tossed into it would be assured a holy passage. Firewood was piled high to burn the infected homes. Processions of monks whipped their own backs bloody in public penance. But still, the bell towers told more for death than for mass. The unseen enemy, how villages vanished in silence. In a nameless village between Paris and Rouen, a peasant boy wakes to silence. The rooster did not crow this morning. The blacksmith's hammer does not strike. No footsteps scrape the mud outside. He tiptoes barefoot past the ashes of the hearth. The stew pot still hangs, but no one stirred it. His mother lies in the same place she was last night, unmoving. Her skin is wet and hot like boiled leather. Her mouth twitches with words she cannot form. In the corner, the baby cries. Across the lane, the church bell rings once. Not for mass, not for marriage, just once. And no one comes. The boy steps outside. The door creaks like a funeral cart. He sees not a soul, only doors left open. Smoke that never rose. Tools abandoned mid-task. A scythe still stuck in straw. A wheelbarrow tipped sideways. Even the goats in the pen are quiet. It feels like waking in a world after judgment. This was the shape of things in 1348, and again in 1349. Not war, not fire, just absence. Whole communities disappeared, not with screams, but with the quiet rattle of a throat and the sound of earth being moved for another shallow grave. Many villages, over 2,000 across Europe, were simply left behind, not burned, not razed, not even fought over. Just empty. Their names vanish from records like ink wiped from a scroll. Some had only 1 or 2 survivors. Often they were children. Others were taken whole, leaving behind twisted doors, tangled wool, and skeletons of cows that starved inside stalls. No trumpet was sounded for this apocalypse, no night road to stop it. The plague spared no one, and it explained nothing. At first, the priests tried. They anointed the dying. They read the Psalms. They carried incense and painted chalk crosses on the doors of the infected. But after a while, the pace of death made rituals collapse. There were simply too many. Bodies piled inside sanctuaries. Pews became stretchers. Baptismal fonts were filled not with water, but with the fevered moans of children too weak to cry. The clergy died to thousands of them. Some took their robes off and fled. Others clung to duty until they too fell. By the 3rd month in most towns, burial rites became impossible. Whispering prayers from a distance, then covered their mouths with cloths soaked in vinegar. There was no time to mourn one person. People mourned whole streets. In a manor on the edge of Lincolnshire, a young bride was set to be wed. The banns had been read. The feast was prepared. Salted pork, sweet mead, and spiced cakes. Her mother had embroidered the veil with tiny golden leaves, each one stitched for luck, but the groom never arrived. He had left London 2 weeks earlier. The roads were slow, thick with carts and confusion. Rumors of plague filled every inn. Some said the Thames was full of corpses. Others said that no bread could be bought for love or coin. He was seen in Cambridge last, then never again. The girl waited 3 days, then 5. Then she locked the veil in a chest and sat quietly by the window. When the cough began, no one spoke of it. The wedding never came, neither did the burial. Only silence. No cure, no hope, no pattern. The people of Messina first heard the sound of chains before they saw the ships. Galleys from the east, their sails torn and stained, limped into harbor like wounded beasts. When men finally came ashore, they collapsed where they stood. The townsfolk ran to help them, mothers bringing water, monks arriving with prayers, merchants shouting for guards. Within 2 days, those same townsfolk were coughing. Some bled from the nose. The ships had brought trade, but this time the cargo was invisible. Within a week, the people of Messina stopped burying their dead in consecrated earth. They piled them in gullies, between fishing boats and under city walls. The disease did not behave like sicknesses people knew. It didn't pass slowly like coughs in winter. It jumped. One day a village was fine. The next, children were falling asleep and not waking. It arrived not in a person, but in a cart of wool, or a letter, or a donkey bearing grain from the next town. Some people died within a day. Others took a week. Some had boils. Some had fever. Some bled from the eyes. Some went mad, tearing their clothes off in the street and screaming that angels were singing under their skin. And the worst part, for all their prayers, for all the fasting and flagellation and holy water, it made no sense. A child nursed by his mother would live while the mother died. A priest with clean hands would fall ill while the beggar beside him was spared. Whole convents vanished, while brothels in the next town stayed open. It followed no rule. It obeyed no saint. Doctors, those who remained, tried what they knew. They lanced the buboes with silver. They burned them with oil. They let blood from the wrist, the thigh, the neck. Some inserted leeches behind the ears or under the arms. Others applied a paste made of ground emerald, basil, and egg yolk, expensive but popular among the noble class. But the swelling did not go away. It grew, blackened, burst, and returned, not because of their bravery, but because of their proximity. Their hands touched too many sores. Their eyes saw too much. Their masks, if they wore any, were soaked, not with herbs but sweat. One doctor in Florence wrote, "The people die faster than I can count them, and my fingers, once used for books, now bury the dead." Another, in Avignon, simply stopped writing. His last note ended, "I think I am next." In Strasbourg, they arrived like a thunderstorm. Hundreds of barefoot men, half naked, their backs bleeding from self-inflicted lashes. They chanted psalms in low tones. Every few steps, they fell to their knees, whipping themselves with cords embedded with nails. Some carried crosses. Others walked blindfolded. Their belief was simple. This was punishment. Not a disease, not a poison, not bad air, but sin, deep, unspoken sin, pouring from mankind like rot from a wound. The Pope did not approve, but the people did. Wherever the flagellants marched, they were welcomed. Bread was laid out for them. Children followed them like a parade. Women cried as they passed. In some places, they stayed too long. They began naming names. They accused certain townsfolk of bringing the plague by heresy, by witchcraft, or by harboring unholy thoughts. Blood followed them like a shadow. In cities where they marched, the fever often came soon after. My friend Father Elric was with me yesterday. Today he is under the same dirt we used to shovel. There is no more incense, no more candles, no one to ring the bells, only the sound of crows and coughing. I dream of clean water, of linen that does not stink. Last night I saw Our Lady in a dream. She turned her face away from me. I think heaven is closed. They burned lavender, rosemary, and juniper in the streets. They smashed windows so air could move freely. They fled to the mountains, the sea, the woods. They avoided foreigners. They avoided their own kin. In others, dogs were killed out of fear. They carried the sickness on their fur. Doctors wore beak masks filled with herbs. Some carried sticks to examine patients from a distance. Others gave up entirely and began writing poems about the end of days. And still the death came. Some towns lost half their people, some 2/3. In certain parts of England, after the second wave, a field of wheat could grow fully, and not a single hand would be left to reap it. The wrath of heaven, or the folly of man. The world had changed, not only in flesh and blood, but in meaning. Before the plague, sickness had been something familiar. The body suffered, yes, but it followed a rhythm, a cold in winter, a fever in summer, coughing, vomiting, bleeding, God's work, God's will. But this was no ordinary trial. It made people question everything. The prayers did not work. The holy water dried up. The priests died first, and when new ones came, they were boys, barely trained, terrified, muttering the rites with trembling fingers. Some churches closed their doors, not to protect the people, but to save what clergy remained. And yet still, the dead. In Paris, a group of scholars examined the sky. They pored over almanacs and Latin scrolls. Some believed the alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 had disturbed the air. Bad humors, poisoned winds, stirred by the heavens themselves. This theory spread across Europe. People spoke of miasma, invisible corruption in the air, bad vapors that seeped into the lungs. The stars have sent us poison, they whispered. To counter it, some wore pomanders, small metal balls filled with spices dangling from belts or necks. Others placed bowls of vinegar and rose petals by the window. Still others walked with sweetened cloths tied across their faces. The air itself had become suspect. Even spring, once a time of joy, was now feared. For warmth brought rot, and rot brought death. Where reason failed, suspicion flourished. In the German territories, whispers became accusations. Outsiders, it was said, had poisoned the wells. Strange herbs, powders, pagan rituals, something unholy had been introduced. In Strasbourg mines and Cologne, Jewish communities were targeted. Some were dragged from their homes. Others were tortured until confessions were extracted. Thousands were burned. Whole neighborhoods vanished in fire, not from plague, but from fear and hatred. In some towns, local officials tried to intervene. The Pope himself issued a bull condemning the violence, but it was too late. The fear had become law. Suspicion had become holy. In some parts of Europe, the Jewish survivors fled east, toward Poland and Lithuania, where the rulers offered a temporary shield. But even there, the shadow of death followed. Among peasants, Different rumors took hold. Some believed a giant serpent had awoken in the sea. Others claimed they had seen fiery knights riding across the sky. A few said the dead were rising, not as saints, but as cursed things, doomed to walk among the living. In the countryside, hermits began appearing. They wore crowns of thorns. Some fasted until they could no longer walk. Others painted their skin with ashes and wandered from village to village, shouting sermons about the final trumpet and the fall of Babylon. Mothers wept openly in church. Children were baptized again and again, just in case. In the cities, artists painted apocalyptic scenes, angels trumpeting over burning towns, demons crawling from graves. But the brushstrokes were frantic, the ink often unfinished. They, too, died before their work was done. By the time the first wave of plague began to fade, somewhere around 1351, Europe had lost an estimated third of its people. Some say it was more. Villages were emptied. Fields lay fallow. Inns stood silent. Roads overgrown. In some places, nature reclaimed the land. Wolves were seen hunting near town gates. Deer grazed in abandoned orchards. But people, those who survived, kept moving. The bells began ringing again. Slowly, carefully, some churches reopened. Marriages were held. Children were born. Markets resumed. But nothing was the same. The world had been cracked open like an egg, and what spilled out could not be put back in. We lived in silence for a year, only the wind and the birds and the creaking of old shutters. Then one day, a girl sang in the alley behind our house. She sang something old, a lullaby. I did not know her, but I cried, because I realized I had not heard music in months. The dead are still in the earth. The plague may return. But the voice of one child, that is where I place my hope. Bizarre beliefs and strange remedies. The medieval medical mind. Near the hills of Montpellier, archaeologists found an old medical garden, covered by dirt and broken plaster. They saw the shapes of garden beds and clay pipes used for water, one of medicine, of hope, of error, of effort. Nearby, broken amphorae still carried faint scents of chamomile, lavender, sage. Inscriptions on clay tags, Latin and Provencal, listed dosages and usage. Contra dolore capitis, against headache. Ad sanandum vulnera, for the healing of wounds. The garden belonged to a monastery, known locally for its infirmary. And though its monks knew little about bacteria or viruses, they knew something more valuable in those years: how not to give up. They knew how to observe. They knew how to soothe pain. They knew when to pray and when to boil the water. In the Middle Ages, it could refer to many different kinds of people, some educated, some not, some careful, some dangerous. Healing was not a single path, but a tangle of roles shaped by religion, local tradition, learning, and sometimes superstition. At the top of this world were the physicians. Most were men trained in the universities of Salerno, Montpellier, or Bologna. If they were lucky enough to afford such education, they wore long robes and often spoke in Latin. But their expertise came from books, not from treating bodies. It was considered beneath them to touch a patient. Instead, they observed from a distance, examining skin, speech, movement, even the scent of sweat or breath. Their judgments were based on ideas passed down from ancient Greece and Rome, particularly the works of Galen. They dealt in theory, not practicality, and left the hands-on work to others. That work often fell to surgeons, a class below them in status. Many of these were barber surgeons, men who learned their trade not through study, but through repeated practice. They pulled teeth, stitched gashes, drained boils, set broken bones, and sometimes even performed amputations. In some towns, the red and white striped poles that still mark barbershops today were born from these dual roles: white for the bandages, red for the blood. Beyond the city streets, especially in rural areas, healing often fell to herbalists and wise women. These people knew plants, which leaves soothed burns, which roots eased stomach pain, and which teas brought down fever. Some learned from family, others from experience. A few operated apothecaries, grinding dried herbs into powders or pastes. Others worked quietly from home. Many were women, midwives, mothers, or widows, whose knowledge was respected until fear turned it dangerous. In times of plague or sudden death, suspicion could arise quickly. If a cure failed, a whisper of witchcraft might follow. A healer one day might be an accused heretic the next. Diagnosing illness was as much art as guesswork. Without microscopes or understanding of germs, healers relied on what they could see, smell, and sometimes taste. Urine was collected in small glass flasks and studied carefully. The color, clarity, even the scent. Some tasted it to detect sweetness, a crude test for diabetes. The most respected method of diagnosis, however, was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These were believed to govern the body's health. If they were in balance, one was well. If not, illness followed. Too much blood meant a person was too hot. The cure might be bloodletting or a cold bath. Too much black bile. That could mean melancholy or a stomach sickness. Treatment followed the pattern: purge the excess, balance the body, restore harmony. These ideas sound foreign now, but they were carefully reasoned and taught in the most learned schools of the time. Medicine was a mixture of ritual, theory, and faith. Some of it worked, much of it didn't. Tools of the trade were crude but real. Archaeologists have found iron scalpels, bronze syringes, and delicate forceps used to remove bone fragments or pull splinters. Some had tools for drilling teeth, others for piercing boils. One surgical set found near York included long, sharp hooks, likely used to lance infections. Another, in Avignon, had slender needles, still dusted, with traces of dried herbal salve. In trained hands, these tools could save lives. In careless hands, they could turn minor injuries into death sentences. Sterilization was unknown. A dirty knife could cause a deadly infection. Yet even small practices, such as cleaning wounds with wine, sometimes helped, if only by accident. Hospitals did exist, though they were very different from those today. Many were attached to monasteries or churches. There, monks and nuns tended to the sick, often as a form of charity or penance. Beds were narrow and shared. Sheets were reused. Prayers echoed through the halls. The goal was to soothe the soul, not always to heal the body. Illness was often seen as a spiritual burden, either a test from God or a punishment for sin. So treatment might include confession, holy water, or placing a saint's relic near the patient's head. In some hospital wards, beds were arranged to face the altar, so the dying could keep their eyes fixed on the cross. For many, spiritual comfort was the only medicine they would ever know. Women remained central to care, especially in smaller villages. Midwives brought life into the world. Herbalists comforted the sick. Widows nursed the dying. Their hands prepared broths, packed poultices, rubbed aching limbs. They knew which herbs could end a fever and which could end a pregnancy. This power made them both respected and feared. Though many were beloved by their neighbors, they were vulnerable. When disease swept through a town, or a child died in the night, the same woman who gave comfort might be blamed. As the centuries passed and the fear of witches grew, these women became targets. Despite all this, people did not give up. They clung to whatever hope they could find. They boiled rosemary and hung it by the door to ward off bad air. They wore amulets filled with lavender or myrrh. They burned sulfur in their homes. They carried garlic in their pockets. They prayed, sang psalms, whispered spells. They drank potions made from honey and ash, chewed willow bark, or swallowed powders ground from crushed pearls. Most of it did little. Some of it did more than they knew. Still, people believed in their gods, in their healers, in the thin hope that tomorrow might be better. And sometimes that belief was enough to carry them through another fever, another night, another prayer. The treatments that actually worked, by accident, despite all the guesswork, superstition, and outdated theories. Some medieval treatments actually worked, not because people fully understood why, but because luck, observation, and trial by ear led them there. In a world where sickness often felt like punishment and death came without warning, these accidental successes offered rare moments of hope. One of the most important remedies was surprisingly simple: honey. Used in wound care across Europe, honey was applied directly to cuts and sores. It clung to skin, blocked out dirt, and kept the wound moist. Without knowing the term antibacterial, healers had stumbled upon one of nature's oldest antibiotics. Honey has enzymes that produce hydrogen peroxide, killing off some bacteria. While many infections still proved fatal, wounds treated with honey often healed better than those left open or packed with herbs. In some monasteries, jars of honey were kept near the infirmary, valued as both food and medicine. Another surprisingly helpful practice was wine. Not as a drink, though it certainly brought comfort, but as a cleanser. Monks and surgeons sometimes poured wine over wounds to wash out dirt and blood. They believed it had spiritual and healing power. What they didn't know was that alcohol in the wine killed some germs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than water drawn from the town's polluted well or a stagnant river. Later, when plague swept through cities, some doctors also suggested bathing in wine or vinegar to draw out the bad humors. That didn't work, but using alcohol on tools or skin may have unintentionally slowed the spread of bacteria in rare cases. There was also willow bark, which certain herbalists used to treat fever and pain. They didn't call it aspirin, of course, but willow bark contains salicin, a natural compound that acts much like modern painkillers. Crushed, brewed into tea, or boiled down into thick pastes, it soothed headaches, reduced swelling, and calmed sore joints. It didn't cure infections or stop the plague, but it brought real relief in an age when most people had no access to anything stronger than boiled herbs. Then there were clay poultices. Healers in some parts of France, England, and the Low Countries used certain earths, rich in minerals like kaolin, to pack wounds or infected sores. The poultices drew out fluid and dried the skin. In some cases, they helped slow down infections like gangrene or staph, though this depended entirely on the soil. Clay taken from clean riverbeds had the best chance of working. Dirty or reused poultices could do the opposite. Still, some monks wrote proudly of blessed earth that saved the lives of the wounded during wartime. Leeches were another treatment that, oddly enough, had mixed success. They were most often used to draw blood in keeping with humoral theory, usually to restore balance. But in rare cases, leeching may have lowered blood pressure or improved circulation in someone dangerously swollen or feverish. Of course, it could also cause infections and weakness. Yet there were moments when the patient walked away better, and that was enough to convince others it was wise. Beyond these physical remedies, some treatments worked simply because they brought calm. In hospitals run by religious orders, patients were bathed in warm water, spoken to softly, and placed in rooms scented with herbs like lavender or sage. Monks and nuns read to them, sang psalms, or allowed family to visit. In a time when fear often worsened sickness, this kind of gentle care reduced anxiety, and that alone sometimes gave the body a better chance at healing. Peace itself became part of the medicine. Other customs, though misunderstood, still helped prevent greater outbreaks. Washing hands before prayer or before entering the church wasn't seen as hygiene, but as a spiritual act, yet it removed dirt and germs. Burning incense or aromatic herbs during services filled the air with compounds that may have repelled fleas or insects. Even the practice of isolation, such as placing the sick in leper houses or plague huts outside town walls, reduced the spread of disease. Though people believed they were protecting their souls from cursed breath or bad air, they were also, in effect, creating quarantines. Animal fats, beeswax, and resins were used to create protective ointments. Applied to the skin, they formed barriers against insects and sometimes infection. In Italy, some doctors mixed rose oil with beeswax and pine resin, creating a salve they believed would ward off the plague. While the scent did nothing to stop a virus, the wax might have helped prevent flea bites, the real culprits behind much of the disease's spread. There were even early versions of surgical tools designed with practical care in mind. Some knives and saws were made from bronze, which has mild antibacterial properties. In emergency surgeries, particularly, amputation's speed and cleanliness were essential. Surgeons worked quickly, often with assistants to hold the patient down, and in the best cases, they boiled water or burned the blades clean with fire. Pain was unavoidable, but if infection didn't set in, some survived. In the darkest moments, people also turned to charms, spells, and relics. Most of these had no healing power at all. But the mind is a powerful thing. If a mother believed the saint's tooth under her pillow would save her child, or if a soldier clutched a bone fragment said to be from a holy martyr, the belief itself might ease their panic, steady their breathing, and slow the slide into fevered despair. In a way, that too was medicine. Much of medieval healing was built on error, but within those errors were small truths, fragments of real science, waiting centuries to be fully understood. People watched what worked and passed it down. A poultice here, a prayer there, a bath, a herb, a careful touch. They recorded their findings in small hand-bound books, traded recipes between villages, and taught apprentices not only where to cut, but when not to. What worked often survived, not in the pages of great medical texts, but in kitchens, gardens, and quiet rooms where someone sat beside a sick child and hoped. Hope itself, in those times, was sometimes the only treatment people could truly afford, and they gave it freely again and again. The things medieval got horribly wrong. Not everything in medieval medicine came from wisdom or gentle observation. In fact, most of it didn't. What we now understand as illness, infections, viruses, organ failure, was often seen instead as divine punishment, demonic interference, or an imbalance of invisible fluids. This misunderstanding didn't just fail to heal people, it sometimes made them worse, and it cost lives. One of the most damaging ideas was the theory of the four humors. Physicians believed the body was ruled by four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health came from keeping these in balance. But illness, they said, happened when one humor overwhelmed the others. If a man had a fever, he was too hot, so they might drain his blood. If a woman had a cough, she might be too wet, so they prescribe purging herbs to dry her out. But these guesses often ignored the real cause of disease. Instead of helping the body fight infection, they weakened it. Patients already on the edge of survival were pushed further, all in the name of theory. Bleeding was especially deadly. Doctors and barbers used sharp knives or cups to draw blood from the arms, neck, or even behind the ears. They believed this would release the bad humors. In plague years, bleeding became nearly automatic. A person with a headache might be bled in the morning, then purged with harsh herbs by night. Some survived in spite of it, others didn't, and no one kept reliable records of either. Then there were the purgatives, strong, bitter mixtures designed to empty the stomach or bowels. Wormwood, hellebore, and even mercury compounds were given to force the body to vomit or defecate. Some patients, already weak from infection, lost too much fluid too quickly. The cure became a form of slow poisoning. But the worse the sickness looked, the more aggressive the treatments became. Desperation fed cruelty. Equally harmful were the spiritual diagnoses. If someone suffered hallucinations or seizures, it wasn't seen as a medical issue, it was sin or sorcery. Families brought the afflicted to churches or shrines instead of physicians. Priests might bless them, beat them, or order fasting and isolation. In some villages, a woman suffering from a fever-induced delirium might be accused of being a witch. In others, a boy who collapsed with convulsions was thought to be possessed. Treatments for these conditions ranged from harsh exorcisms to total abandonment. And in some monasteries, silence was seen as sacred. Dying patients lay in their beds, watched but untouched, while novices whispered prayers nearby. There were no questions, no diagnoses, no attempts to understand. Some monks feared that even touching the sick might bring on divine punishment, so they let them die quietly, hoping their souls would pass in peace. But the peace was not always kind. Plague brought even more confusion. When the Black Death spread across Europe, people grasped for meaning. Some blamed the stars. Others blamed miasma, bad air that drifted through cities like a curse. So towns burned herbs in the streets or fired cannons to clear the air. These acts did nothing to stop the spread, but they gave a sense of control. In desperation, the church organized mass prayers and public processions. People marched barefoot, weeping and chanting. Some whipped themselves bloody, believing that suffering would cleanse their towns. But gathering so many people close together only made the plague worse. Perhaps one of the cruelest mistakes was the scapegoating of communities. Jewish neighborhoods, already marginalized, were accused of poisoning wells and bringing disease. In Strasbourg mines, and other cities, entire Jewish quarters were destroyed. People were burned, drowned, or exiled, not for what they did, but because others feared what they could not explain. It was fear disguised as protection, and it turned pain into violence. Some of the worst errors came not from treatment, but from rejection. Lepers, for example, were cast out entirely. Once diagnosed, they were declared dead to the world, given a robe, a bell, and exiled to colonies outside city walls. Though leprosy was not as contagious as many believed, fear outweighed compassion. Even those who had recovered were often never allowed to return. The same fate awaited plague survivors. After healing, some returned to homes where no one would speak to them. The sickness may have left their bodies, but not their lives. Childbirth was another place where mistaken beliefs caused tragedy. Midwives sometimes followed traditions passed down without question, tying iron around a woman's ankles, forcing her to lie still, or smearing herbs on her stomach to release the child. Some of these helped, others caused bleeding or infection. If the child died, it was often blamed on the woman's thoughts or sins, her inward corruption. No one understood germs. No one knew that washing hands between patients could save a life. That knowledge wouldn't come for centuries. Animals, too, were sometimes used in bizarre ways. To cure swelling, a frog might be tied to the throat until it died. To stop convulsions, live pigeons were cut open and pressed to the soles of the feet. These methods were based on folklore, not results. But the worse the illness, the stranger the treatment became. And all the while, records were scattered, incomplete. Physicians guarded their knowledge in Latin, their books copied only by hand. There was no shared hospital system, no coordinated learning. What worked in one town might never reach another. What failed might be repeated for decades, simply because it was all anyone had ever known. Still, people tried. Parents held feverish children. Wives boiled herbs for dying husbands. Village healers risked accusations of witchcraft just to offer comfort. Their failures were tragic, but they were not lazy. They were trapped in a world without microscopes, without understanding of infection, and without access to new knowledge. What they got wrong wasn't just medicine. It was the silence around suffering, the belief that pain was punishment, that disease was weakness, that God alone must decide. But in the cracks between mistakes, in the tenderness of a touch, in the chance of a clean wound, in a monk's gentle voice, something true began to grow, even if they couldn't name it. A diagnosis made by stars in medieval times in the year 1349. As the Black Death swept through the cities and countryside, not every doctor reached for herbs or prayers. Some turned their eyes to the sky. For them, healing began not with the body, but with the stars. This was not a fringe belief. Universities taught it. Kings relied on it. Astrologers, often trained in medicine, were consulted before surgeries or bloodletting. They created star charts for patients, noting the exact moment an illness began. From there, they calculated which organs were under celestial influence and which treatments might align with the movements of the heavens. In London, a medical manuscript from the mid-14th century contained a diagram of a man surrounded by zodiac signs. Each part of the body was ruled by a different constellation Aries for the head, Taurus the neck, Leo the heart, and so on. If the moon was in a sign ruling the sick part of the body, bloodletting was delayed. It was believed the stars could either open the body to healing or shut it against it. There is a quiet logic to this, one born from desperate observation. the moon moved tides might. The stars marked the seasons might. They not also guide the seasons of the body? These weren't ignorant superstitions, but earnest attempts to understand patterns where little else made sense. In the city of Padua, medical students practiced the casting of horoscopes alongside anatomy. A patient might be diagnosed with an imbalance of humorous phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and blood, but their treatment plan would be adjusted by the alignment of Saturn or the rising of Mars. If Venus ruled the hour, sweet herbs might be chosen. If Mars dominated, then sharp or bitter ones. To the modern mind, this feels alien. But for a medieval doctor, the stars were just one more text to read, like a pulse or a tongue. They believed the universe and the body mirrored one another. A great harmony, disrupted by illness, restored by precision. Even as plague corpses piled in the streets, some physicians clung to this order. They drew charts beside the beds of the dying. They calculated the hour of contagion. They advised patients to avoid certain foods, not just for digestion, but because of planetary heat or moisture. They were trying, in a way, to speak the language of the universe, hoping it might offer mercy. And sometimes, strangely, it did. Not because the stars cured disease, but because attention-focused, organized, thoughtful attention makes a difference. A patient whose symptoms were carefully tracked, whose diet was watched, whose mood was soothed by structured ritual, often fared better. Astrology, then, was not only about the sky, it was about bringing meaning to chaos. Of course, it couldn't stop the plague. The heavens gave no immunity, but they offered a sense of order when the world collapsed. And for many, that order was the first step toward healing, if it only calmed the heart while the body burned. In hidden monasteries and bustling cities alike, star maps hung beside herb lists. It was a medicine of belief as much as balm. A belief that somewhere, out there, the universe still held patterns, that if one could read them well enough, suffering might be easy, not ended, perhaps, but softened. And in a world of pain, that was no small thing, of saints and smoke, life in the time of plague, high in the Pyrenees, in a stone monastery, surrounded by clouds and silence. Monks once guarded a small fragment of bone. It was said to belong to Saint Sebastian, the man who, according to legend, survived a storm of arrows, was later beaten to death, and still became a symbol of hope against the plague. People from far away, weak with hunger and sickness, climbed the mountain just to touch the reliquary. Some left healed, others did not. Still, they kept coming. In those days, saints weren't only remembered, they were called upon like healers. Their relics were carried through plague-stricken towns in long, solemn processions. Streets glowed with candlelight. Latin prayers echoed from windows. Statues of saints were washed in wine, perfumed with incense, and marched through the city as if they were alive. This was more than religion. It was healing for the soul, medicine for the fear that gripped people's hearts. In the medieval world, illness wasn't just about infection. It was also about guilt, sin, and divine anger. Healing meant more than herbs. It meant cleansing the heart. When cures failed, people turned to faith. In one village, after a farmer saw a vision of Saint Rochtha, saint who guarded against plague, townsfolk built a shrine overnight. They brought the sick there, anointed them with oil, and lit fires to chase away evil. A few days later, 3 people recovered. That was enough. The shrine stood for generations. Not all rituals were quiet or serious. In parts of Bohemia, people lit fires at crossroads and danced through the smoke, believing it would keep the plague away. In rural France, shepherds waved rosemary over their sheep, whispering old prayers taught by grandmothers. Even in cities where doctors argued about stars and the balance of humors, these folk customs never died out. They were passed on in stories, in habits, in memory, from mothers to daughters, from neighbors to friends. No books, just voices, hands, and trust, a whispered charm, a branch of herbs, a pouch sewn into a coat. It was a kind of medicine one, made from community, belief, and courage. It may not have cured the body, but it often calmed the heart. A child felt safer after prayer. A mother found comfort in ritual. A dying man breathed easier with the scent of lavender in the air. When nothing made sense, rituals brought order. When science fell silent, belief stepped in. And in the quiet moments between coughing fits and candle flames, something powerful took root. Not a miracle, but hope, steady and soft like the gentle glow of a saint's candle burning through the night. The surgeons who worked without sleep, not all who tended the sick in the Middle Ages, came with incense or star charts. Some came with knives. The medieval surgeon was a practical manor. Sometimes, a woman trained not in theory but in the harsh laboratory of pain. They worked in the same guilds as barbers and butchers, learning through apprenticeship rather than university. Their tools were few, their techniques brutal, and their risks high. Yet, in times of plague and war, they were indispensable. During the great pestilences, surgeons found themselves in relentless demand. While physicians debated humors and astrologers calculated the heavens, surgeons drained abscesses, lanced buboes, cut away necrotic flesh, and cauterized wounds with iron heated over flame. They did not pretend to cure the plague, but they could offer a grim kind of mercy, to open the skin and release the rot before it poisoned the blood entirely. They slept little. In towns overcome by disease, some worked until their hands shook and their eyes blurred with exhaustion. Tools were dipped in vinegar or boiled between patients, not from an understanding of microbes, but from sheer, desperate habit. Infection still spread, but sometimes, just sometimes, their actions prolonged a life. A surgeon's kit might contain knives, saws, probes, cautery irons, and sponges soaked in vinegar or wine. Their workspace was rarely a sterile hall. It was a patient's home, a monastery infirmary, a tent beside a battlefield. They operated in candlelight, beside beds crawling with lice, under the eyes of grieving families, in corners where priests had already whispered last rites. Apprentices began young, learning to stitch wounds, pull teeth, and amputate limbs. They practiced on pigs or criminals. They memorized where to cut and where not to. Some developed astonishing skill. Others, working with trembling hands and gut-turning smells, failed before they began. The work hardened the heart, horror broke it. In Paris, the Faculty of Surgery eventually formed its own college, insisting on standards. But elsewhere, most surgeons learned by doing. Many died from the same diseases they tried to fight. They lacked masks, gloves, or antiseptic. Some tied cloth over their faces or rubbed their hands with garlic, hoping the smell might guard them. It rarely did. Yet people trusted them. In villages where no physician would go, the surgeon came. Not because he was paid well, he often wasn't, but because someone had to. There are records of surgeons standing knee-deep in plague pits, stitching shut the wounds of those who might still recover. Others assisted midwives, set bones, drained boils, removed arrowheads. They were the body's last defenders when the spirit had failed and the heavens stayed silent. They were not saints. They were tired, flawed, and often afraid. But they kept going. Not for glory, not for coin, for duty, for habit, for the sheer refusal to let suffering stand unchallenged. In their wake, they left scars, but also stories of hands that trembled, yes, but still reached out, of nights spent beside the dying, not in prayer, but in action, of healing that came not from miracles, but from persistence. And in that, perhaps, they offered something sacred after all. Living rich, while the world burned medieval times, while disease crept into every alley and hamlet, the first reaction of the wealthy was not action, but confusion. In the early days of outbreaks, whether in 1347's plague or during lesser-known fevers before it, wealthy merchants and noble families didn't yet understand what threatened them. They knew something was coming. Rumors whispered of ships arriving with sickness, of distant towns gone silent. But what could truly reach them behind their stone manor walls? In cities like Florence, Paris, and London, the first signs of trouble were not dead bodies, but disappearances. A servant girl no longer reported to her station. A cook refused to return from the market. When physicians began to leave without notice, the wealthy realized something was wrong. Letters were dispatched, horses saddled. Some families vanished overnight, riding out into the countryside with chests of silver and bolts of linen packed behind them. Others hesitated, trusting that money could build a barrier against the invisible threat. They ordered more wine, burned incense, sent for private doctors. Those who fled often traveled not for hours but days, seeking their second homestone hunting lodges, summer villas, estates far from the city walls. There they hoped the air would be cleaner, the plague less potent. Town records across Europe show sudden drops in noble population during plague years, yet spikes in rural noble presence. Flight was the first luxury of privilege. But not all were so swift. Some remained behind, bound by title or duty, convinced that their homes larger, cleaner, richer would protect them. They rarely opened their gates. Letters were boiled in vinegar before being read. Servants bathed in rose water before allowed inside. Suspicion became ritual, and as bodies began to line the streets outside, the panic among the privileged deepened. But theirs was a quiet, distant fear, one softened by walls, perfumed cloth, and the illusion of control. Among the elite, fear took on the scent of flowers. Perfumed masks, scented gloves, and sweet-smelling herbs weren't just signs of refinement, they were believed to be shields. It was widely thought that disease traveled through foul air, miasma, so the richer you smelled, the safer you were. Noblemen carried pomander silver balls packed with spices like cloves, nutmeg, or ambergris. Wealthy women pinned sachets of lavender and rosemary to their gowns. Even religious leaders, blessing the sick from afar, held orange-studded cloves beneath their noses. The scent was both comfort and defense. Textiles became barriers. The nobility commissioned cloaks of waxed cloth or lined their sleeves with juniper sprigs. Garments were layered, not just for warmth or modesty, but for imagined protection. Gloves were soaked in vinegar or wine before being worn. Vows already fashionable became longer, more opaque. In some court circles, it was considered poor form to appear in public, without a mask or scented accessory. Some nobles even paid for entire rooms to be fumigated daily with burned herbs. Sandalwood, frankincense, and thyme were popular, not just for their smell, but their cost. The more fragrant the air, the more it reeked of status. These practices didn't cure disease, but they gave the privileged a sense of control and reinforced the social divide. To smell sweet was to signal distance from the filth of the city, from the breath of peasants, from the imagined source of death itself. Despite the creeping fear and rising death toll, some among the elite clung to ritual and revelry. As grim as it may seem, documented feasts occurred in plague years even during the worst months. In castles and manors across Europe, nobles held banquets not in defiance of death, but to distract from it. Food was a comfort hand, a signal. Tables overflowed with roasted meats, candied fruits, and pies sculpted into birds and beasts. The more elaborate the spread, the greater the illusion of safety. Musicians were hired, dancers performed, tapestries were drawn to cover windows, blocking both draught and the sight of funeral carts outside. But the joy was uneasy. Servants were fewer. Some chairs remained empty guests, either too afraid to travel or already taken by illness. Coughs drew silence. A tipped goblet might lead to glances of suspicion. No one spoke of the dead unless, in euphemism, they had retired to the country. They had taken ill from poor digestion. And yet the bells tolled. Church bells rang daily for those who had passed. Even far from the city, the sound carried. It rang across meadows and vineyards, a slow, steady reminder. With each note, the illusion cracked. Some nobles kept personal priests to bless their halls and beds. Others hired physicians full-time, feeding them, housing them, treating them as both guardians and prisoners. These doctors, once celebrated, now lived in isolation, unable to leave without risking dismissal or worse. Still, the dance continued. Until one day, it didn't. When death reached the manor walls, it moved fast. Within days, entire households vanished. Records remain of noble families whose names ended in a single week. Their homes, once fragrant and fortified, stood silent-sealed by fear or opened by the hands of thieves. Privilege delayed death. It didn't deny it. Retreat into fantasy in medieval times as physical defenses faltered. The elite turned inward into books, art, and elaborate fictions. This was not a time of darkness alone, but of strange beauty. The 14th and 15th centuries saw the rise of allegorical paintings, stories of enchanted gardens, visions of chivalric purity untouched by disease. Manuscripts were copied with golden ink, margins filled with absurd creatures, frogs, riding dogs, fish climbing trees. These weren't just amusements, they were escapes. They allowed the viewer to believe in a world where logic bent and sickness had no place. In noble courts, poetry readings replaced feasts. Small theater performances, often by household staff, entertained lords and ladies too afraid to travel. Tales of distant lands, of saints and sinners, of battles and blessings, carried their imaginations far from the stench of decay. Some nobles commissioned murals of paradise on their walls. Others paid for family portraits in which the dead appeared alive, retouched and reimagined. The past was painted prettier than it had been, the future blurred. Faith, too, played a part. Wealth allowed for private chapels, relics purchased at high price and daily mass held in ornate halls. But faith among the privileged was often quieter, less fiery than the street sermons of the poor. It was personal, softened by luxury, reshaped by fear. This was not just about escaping disease. It was about preserving identity. If they could not stop the plague, they could at least control their surroundings, their memory, their legacy. And in doing so, they left behind a strange echo: gilded books, perfumed letters, silent rooms filled with masks and mirrors, a world burning yet determined to forget the smoke. For some, the gamble failed spectacularly. Estates, once bustling with laughter and labor, stood hollow. Great halls, built for feasts, echoed with the wind. Gardens, once clipped by teams of servants, went wild with weeds. And behind bolted doors, corpses decayed in velvet beds. Local records from England, France, and the Low Countries describe noble homes left abandoned, their gates rusted, orchards overtaken by vines, and wells brimming with leaves. Inheritance disputes flared in the courts, but there was often little left to claim. Silver was stolen, books torn apart for their gold leaf pages. Sacred relics, meant to protect, were pried loose and traded. Some noble families died out entirely. With no surviving heir, their names disappeared from history. Others survived only on paper titles, passed to distant cousins who never stepped foot in the ancestral halls. The physical symbols of Wealthland, banners, chapels became reminders not of power, but of fragility. There were also opportunists, merchants who bought manors for cheap, clerics who moved into quiet villas, bandits who lived like lords until another force pushed them out. The line between highborn and low began to blur it out of equality, but vacancy. And still, above these empty homes, family crests hung, weathered and fading, symbols of houses that once believed themselves immune. Disease proved otherwise. It took not only bodies, but bloodlines. What was left after the noble homes fell silent? Not just ruined estates, but an inheritance of unease. The generation that followed inherited wealth, but also superstition, loss, and quiet dread. Stories passed in whispers of ghosts that roamed rose gardens, of family treasures cursed by plague. Grandchildren grew up in drafty halls, surrounded by portraits of relatives they never knew, faces repainted to hide lesions, eyes staring blankly from the past. Some tried to forget. Estates were renamed, chapels rebuilt, plague relics buried or sold. Others leaned into the legacy, turning family deaths into sainthood stories, commissioning plaques, building myths. But no family emerged unmarked. Even in success, there was suspicion. Who had died and who had survived? And how this final inheritance, the silence, the rewriting of memory, the carefully groomed lineage defined elite families for generations. Their letters speak less of celebration, more of caution. Joy was quieter, weddings smaller, trust rarer. The world had burned, and they had watched behind windows. Some had danced, some had fled, all were changed. And that, perhaps, is the truest mark of privilege: to endure, to erase, and to reshape the memory of suffering into something beautiful, distant, and unreal. Outside, the wind has quieted. The manor halls have gone still. The linen has been folded. The prayers have been said, and even the watchmen have left their posts. The world we've wandered of fear and fever, of silent suffering and gilded denial, now rests behind us, like the closing of a heavy door. And maybe that's where it belongs for now. In the hush between waking and sleep, where old stories soften into dreams. You've stayed with this tale longer than most would, through illness, through despair, through fleeting comforts and fragile certainties, and that, in itself, is something rare. It means you've listened not just with curiosity, but with care. Let this be the moment you let go of it all. Let the dust settle, let the bells fade. And as your breath slows, know this: the past doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It only needs to be remembered. If this story brought you a little peace, a little stillness, or simply helped the day feel lighter, subscribe to this channel. There are more quiet truths to tell, more roads to wander, more voices, history left behind, waiting to be heard in the calm of night. Sleep well, and thank you for walking with us.